Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of The Way the World Works, a Tuttle Twins podcast. As always, I am your host, Brittany Hunter. Let's get started. So today I want to pick up where an episode we had a few weeks ago left off. We talked about Independence Day and the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which, if you remember, was actually signed the 2nd of July, 1776. Not the 4th, so that's a fun piece of trivia you can use to impress all your friends and family members at your next social gathering. But what happened after the Declaration was signed? You sign a declaration, you break up with Britain, you start a war. What now? Something has to govern this new country. And remember, this is years before the Constitution was signed. And so what happened in between there? And sometimes, especially I think in public schools, we kind of gloss over this and you don't really get the meat of what happened in between that period of time. And that is what I want to talk to you about today. So this whole governing with all the 13 colonies, which were now states together, this was very new. You had some bodies of people that met. Obviously, we had the Second Continental Congress that signed the Declaration and ratified it and helped vote on it. But the Second Continental Congress preceded or came after the First Continental Congress. And I want to talk about what that means. And basically what it just meant is it was like another session, like it was another round. So there was the First Continental Congress that had some people in it. And then there was a new Continental Congress with maybe a few new members in there. And we actually do something similar today. Like right now, we are in our 118th Congress, and that is done every 2 years. So every 2 years, we get a new congressional number. They take a big picture. It's like a family photo, and that's it. So if that confuses you, just remember we do something similar today. So those were that was the Second Continental Congress was kind of the only body, the joining of the many states, but it couldn't really do anything. So now we are in July 1776. We got to figure out what government is going to be in place while we're fighting this war. And so about a week later, they come together and there's a committee that joins to start drafting the Articles of Confederation. So that's July. November 15th, the articles are adopted by this Congress, but they weren't ratified and made the actual national form of government until 1781. So that's a long time. And it's actually not that long before the Constitution comes along. And the Constitution came along because the articles didn't really do everything they were supposed to do, or they didn't do it well, I should say. And so there were some shortcomings. And so they had to go back to the drawing board and figure it all out again. So what did these articles do? Well, there are 13 Articles of Confederation. And Confederation, of course, is a group of people that come together for a common cause. So in this case, it's the colonies, now the states, who are coming together to form this new union, right? It's very exciting for them. So there are 13 colonies. There are 13 Articles of Confederation. That's easy to remember, right? That's fun. But let's talk about one of the main things it did. I'm not going to talk about everything, because if we talked about everything, it would get a little too in the weeds. And I think that's things we can dissect in other episodes. But one of the main things and important things it did is it gave the country a name. And that is real important, because think about it. You got this great new country. You're so excited. You have to be able to call it something. So the United States of America, spoiler alert, I'm sure you didn't know that was coming, is what was born out of the Articles of Confederation. And the second thing it did was establish this new Congress. And Congress then looks a little different than Congress today. And the reason Congress is the way it is today is because of how it was then. There were some things that didn't work out. And the main thing was that in Congress, every state had one vote. So one person was representing them. They got one vote. And not everybody loved this idea, because you're going to have to remember that people or places like Massachusetts had a lot more people on them than some of the other colonies. And so Massachusetts is over here saying, why are we getting one vote and, one representative when we represent way more people than this little colony, or state now, over here? And so that caused a lot of problems. And you have to remember at this time, before we declared independence, every state was pretty much acting like its own little country. They had their own set of laws that worked best for them, because who better to make laws for your own local area than the people who live there? And that's where we get this idea of state sovereignty, this idea that every state is the most qualified to make their own laws for their own people, and that we should give those states' independence. So that is why we're called the United States, because even though we are one, confederation back then, but one union, we're one union of many, which I think is really cool because it also reflects how individualism runs throughout this country, right? We are, at the end of the day, individuals who have chosen to join together. We have consented to join together, or ideally speaking, we've consented to join together to agree to laws that help keep us free. And what I say by that is not the kind of laws where it's like, oh, we have to go through TSA and we have to have our privacy violated to keep us safe. Not like that. But, government is supposed to be there to protect life, liberty, and property. And so to that end, that is why governments were established, ideally speaking, in the ideal world. That was the idea. That hasn't always gone to plan. So Congress had some flaws. And you'll notice today we do things very differently. So today we have a bicameral House of Congress, and bicameral, think about bicycle. There are two wheels. So when you see that word bi, that's going to usually mean that it's about two things. So the way we corrected that, the articles flaws of Congress under the Constitution, is we made two different kinds of representation. So you have Congress. Congress has 435 members, and that is because every state gets the number of representatives, like the number of congressmen and women, that reflect how many people are in their state. So California, big state, they have, I think, 52, where Florida only has 28 because it's a little bit smaller. So you're going to get representatives based on your country, or your country size. I was going to say country side, but country size. But then you have the Senate. And in the Senate, every state gets 2 votes. Every state has 2 representatives, 2 senators. So they did it that way to appease the bigger states and the smaller states. Everybody wins. Ideally, that's what would happen. But that corrected the what was wrong with Congress under the Articles of Confederation. Congress also couldn't do that much. They could pass resolutions, but they couldn't really enforce laws or pass laws. Instead, what it could do was make resolutions. And a resolution is basically like saying, here's what we recommend, but we really don't have any authority or any means of making this an actual law that people have to abide by. So what could Congress actually do? They could make war and peace. That's important. Send and receive ambassadors from other countries to, have good relations, to make friends with people. They could make treaties. They could coin money. They could settle disputes between different states. That being said, they had no power to tax or enforce the laws. So like I said, it was actually pretty weak. There wasn't a whole lot they could do. And this would cause a lot of problems later. And I will get into that in another episode. But there were a lot of things that led up to the articles not working and for the people to realize, okay, we need a better plan. But there was one big instigating event that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. So I think we'll do a whole episode on that because that's pretty important. But there were some moments, or there was that one moment where it was like, okay, we may not have thought this through enough. So overall, the articles were pretty weak when it comes to a big central government, but not everyone thought that was a bad thing. So that is where even today, there's a lot of debate over the Articles of Confederation versus the Constitution, because the Constitution did make the federal government much stronger than it was ever intended to be by the early founders and framers. But they did it because these weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation caused some issues. And so it's a very real reason for them to say, okay, maybe we need to go back to the drawing board. But there is some debate about it even now, because some people might look at the articles and say, I kind of like that, because it was a very loose union of these sovereign independent states, and states' rights and state sovereignty was at the core, honestly, the foundation of the beginning of this country, because it was not the United States as this one union that didn't exist. It was these mini countries, right? These states, these colonies, who were really the ones who were like, all right, we want our independence. So weak central government, whether or not you think that's a good or bad thing, that is debatable. So that's a really interesting conversation to have. There was no executive or judicial branch. So as we know today, we have 3 branches of government. Executive, that is going to be the president, but not just the president. The executive branch is also all those administrative agencies. Sometimes we hear them called the administrative state. So EPA, FDA, TSA, those are all things that come through the executive branch. So we have executive, president, all those agencies, administrative state. And then we have Congress, of course, who is the only body and branch of government that is allowed to pass laws, make laws. And then we have the judicial system, judiciary branch, which, as you know, if somebody gets accused of breaking a law, or there's a dispute between the branches of government, you go to the courts, and the courts are this neutral body that get to listen to both arguments and decide. So without a judicial branch and without an executive branch, there were no checks and balances. There was no separation of power because there wasn't even anything to separate the powers between. And so that was a big problem. And that is something that I do think the Constitution improved a lot, because separation of powers and having everyone check them. And what I mean by check them is the judicial branch can only do certain things. The executive branch can only do certain things. And Congress can only do certain things. And they have to stay in their lane. And if they don't, if they start trampling on others' rights, which usually means they're also trampling on our rights, the courts or someone steps in, usually it's the courts in this circumstance, and says, hey, no, you're not allowed to do this. So let's say, for example, Congress passed a law that is overstepping its rights. The president can veto it. And this happens a lot. Let's say the executive and its many administrative states start trying to pass and write laws, which they are not allowed to do. The Supreme Court sometimes intervenes and is like, no, you're not allowed to do that. That's a whole other topic also. But so that was a big weakness of the Articles of Confederation, because you needed those checks. The whole reason we started a new country is there was too much power by the king. He had ultimate authority. He was a tyrant. And so this was really important to correct. And that is something that the Articles of Confederation just didn't really do well. So by 1787, it's pretty clear that the Articles of Confederation are not going to work. There are too many flaws they're running into. They've got to think of something better. And so the Constitutional Convention, they meet and they start drafting or framing. That's why we call, there's founding fathers and then there's framers, and the framers are the ones who framed the Constitution. So this is a big event. We'll talk about this in probably a few episodes. So September 1787 is when the Constitution is signed and ratified by this convention, but it's not going to go into effect until 1789. And so during this time, the Articles of Confederation are still in effect because they wanted something in place to try, even though they knew that it wasn't perfect. And the Constitution isn't perfect either. In fact, it's very important to remember that it was referred to as, it's kind of America's a more perfect union, and more perfect meaning it's not perfect, but it's better than what we had before. And that's very important to remember, that even though the Constitution is amazing, it limits government, and it gives us, or it doesn't give us, because we're born with our rights, but it helps protect our rights from governments, because governments will always try to be squashing our rights. So that is how the Articles of Confederation came to an end. But it's very important. Again, I wanted to do this episode to remind you that something came in between. We forget about that a lot. It's like Declaration, Constitution, but there's this whole other thing that was in place for a while. And even though it failed, like I said, some people might think it wasn't as bad as people said it was. Like, there were some good things about it, but even though it failed, we learned so much from that. And we're going to get into something called the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers, they're really going to touch on what they got right and what they got wrong. And it's a wild ride. So yeah, there's going to be a lot going on. This is a really interesting time of American history, because the world is our oyster, as they say. We had a blank slate to figure out who we wanted to be. Articles didn't work. And so now the story is going to continue with the Constitutional Convention. And remember, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Like I said, I like to give you guys breadcrumbs to figure out more of the historical puzzle as a family. And if you don't already, two great resources for these are the Tuttle Twins American History books. And one stops in 1776 and the other picks up in 1776. So for this topic, both are really, really useful. And then, of course, we have the Tuttle Twins Academy, which has a U.S. history course. So if you want to find out more about the Constitution and the Articles and everything that happened in between, please check out these two resources. And we will leave it there for today. Please, as always, don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast. And as always, we'll talk to you later.